The old farmhouse stood like a gray stone against the endless green tide of the Appalachian forests. For 40 years, it had been Arthur Pembroke's entire world. First with his wife, Eleanor, and now, for the last decade, alone. His days were measured by the slow crawl of the sun across the wide Pennsylvania sky, the crow of his rooster, and the familiar aches in his bones. Life was a quiet, predictable rhythm, and Arthur liked it that way. The world outside, with its noise and its haste, felt as distant as the moon he sometimes watched from his porch swing. His property was vast and isolated, a winding dirt road, more a memory of a path than a real road, was the only thing connecting him to the small town of Mill Creek, 5 miles away. His closest neighbors were the deer, the bears, and the ancient trees that had stood on this land for centuries. They were quiet company, and they kept their secrets. Arthur kept his. Tonight, however, the rhythm was broken. A storm was brewing. Not a normal summer storm with its honest thunder and cleansing rain, but a strange, silent one. The air was thick, heavy with an electricity that made the hairs on Arthur's arms stand up. The sky to the northwest pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, but there was no thunder, no sound at all. Even the crickets and the frogs, the usual nighttime orchestra of the woods, had fallen silent. Arthur sat on his porch, a lukewarm cup of coffee in his wrinkled hands, watching the silent light show. He was 72, a veteran of a war he rarely spoke of, and a man who had learned to trust his instincts above all else. And his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. This silence was unnatural. It was a held breath. Around 11 p.m., it happened. It wasn't a loud crash. It was a sound that didn't belong, a deep, resonant thrum, like a giant's tuning fork being struck and then muffled by the earth. It was a sound felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled from the soles of his worn leather boots right up into his chest. It was followed by a long, tearing, splintering roar as ancient trees were ripped from their roots. Then silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Arthur didn't move for a full minute. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. It could have been a meteor or a small plane. The local airfield was notorious for its poor maintenance, but the light hadn't been the white of a falling star, and the sound wasn't the sputtering cough of a dying engine. It was something else, something clean and powerful. He slowly stood up, his joints protesting. He went inside, ignoring the urge to call the sheriff. What would he say? That he heard a strange noise? In these mountains, strange noises were a part of life. No, this was his land, his silence that had been broken. He would be the one to investigate. He pulled on his thickest coat, grabbed the heavy million-candle-power flashlight from its hook by the door, and then hesitated. His eyes fell upon the old, double-barreled shotgun resting above the fireplace. He hadn't fired it in years, but the weight of it in his hands was a familiar comfort. He broke it open, slid 2 heavy shells into the chambers, and clicked it shut, just in case. The woods were predictable, but whatever had just fallen into them was not. Stepping outside, the air was even colder now, thick with the smell of ozone and freshly broken pine. He clicked on the flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a perfect white tunnel through the oppressive darkness. He walked past his barn, its red paint faded to a dull rust, and towards the tree line where the sound had come from. The walk was slow. He knew these woods better than anyone, every rock and every stream, but tonight they felt different. Alien. The silence was unnerving. As he got closer to the source of the sound, the damage became clear. A massive furrow was torn through the forest, a scar of splintered wood and upturned earth over 100 yards long. Great oaks and pines, trees that had stood when his grandfather was a boy, were snapped in half like twigs. He followed the path of destruction, his boots sinking into the soft, disturbed soil. The smell was stronger here, a strange mix of burnt sugar and charged metal. And at the end of the scar, nestled into the side of a small hill, was the source. It was not a plane. It was a craft, sleek and dark, made of a material that seemed to drink the light from his flashlight. It was impossibly smooth, with no seams, no rivets, no windows. It was shaped like a teardrop or a smoothed river stone, and it was deeply embedded in the earth. It wasn't large, maybe the size of his pickup truck. Smoke or vapor hissed quietly from a jagged tear in its hull, the only sign of damage. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. Every crazy story he'd ever heard on late-night radio, every blurry photo he'd seen in cheap magazines, it was all real. And it had crashed on his land. His mind raced. He should leave. Call the authorities. The military, someone, anyone. But then, he heard another sound. It was faint, coming from the gash in the craft's hull. It wasn't a mechanical noise. It was a soft, pained cry, a whimper. It wasn't human, but it was unmistakably the sound of a living creature in distress, a creature that sounded young and terrified. And in that moment, Arthur Pembroke made a choice. He lowered his gun, took a deep breath, and walked towards the fallen star, not as a hunter, but as a neighbor. The air around the craft was cold, humming with a low-level energy that made the fillings in Arthur's teeth ache. He approached the jagged tear in the hull cautiously, his shotgun now held loosely in one hand, pointing towards the ground. The metal, or whatever it was, wasn't sharp. The edges of the rupture were smooth and rounded, almost as if the material had melted and re-solidified in an instant. He peered inside. The darkness within was absolute, a stark contrast to the pulsing green glow he had seen in the sky. His flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by it. He took another step, leaning closer, and the whimpering sound came again, clearer this time. It was a high-pitched, chittering sound, laced with what could only be described as fear. "Hello?" Arthur called out, his voice raspy and uncertain. It felt absurd talking to this impossible object. "Anyone in there? Are you hurt?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint light flickered from the depths of the ship. It wasn't a mechanical light, but a soft, biological glow, like a firefly's pulse. It grew steadily brighter, casting long, strange shadows. And in that gentle illumination, he saw them. There were 3 of them. 2 were huddled in the far corner, their forms slender and graceful. They were tall, perhaps taller than him, with long limbs and smooth, pale skin that seemed to shimmer with a faint luminescence of its own. They had no visible clothing, yet they didn't seem naked. Their bodies were elegant and simple, like sculptures carved from mother of pearl. The third one, the source of the crying, lay closer to the opening. It was small, no bigger than a human child, and one of its long, delicate legs was bent at an unnatural angle, trapped beneath a heavy-looking panel that must have been dislodged in the crash. Their faces were the most striking part. Large, dark eyes, like pools of liquid obsidian, dominated their heart-shaped heads. They had no discernible mouths or noses, yet Arthur felt their gaze on him, a gaze filled with terror, intelligence, and a plea for help. The larger of the 2 adults moved, placing itself protectively in front of the smaller one. It raised a hand with 3 long, slender fingers, and the air between them shimmered. Arthur felt a pressure in his mind, not a voice, but a feeling, an overwhelming wave of pure emotion, fear, danger, Go away." Arthur stopped. He held up his free hand, palm open, showing he meant no harm. He slowly, deliberately leaned his shotgun against a nearby fallen tree, making sure they could see him do it. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and calm, the way he used to speak to a frightened animal. "I heard the crash. I live here. You're on my property." He took a slow step forward. The adult tensed but didn't move. The feeling in his head intensified, but now it was mixed with something else, confusion. "The little one," Arthur said, nodding towards the trapped child. "Is it hurt?" He pointed at the panel, then at the child's leg. He mimed the action of lifting. The being seemed to understand. The pressure in his head lessened slightly. The large dark eyes blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. A new feeling, cautious and questioning, replaced the fear. "Help?" "Yes," Arthur whispered. "Help." He moved forward until he was at the edge of the opening. The panel was made of the same dark material as the hull, and it looked impossibly heavy. He reached in, his weathered hands touching the cool, smooth surface. He found a handhold and pulled. It didn't budge. He grunted, straining, his old muscles screaming in protest. It was no use. He looked at the taller being. It watched him, its head tilted. Arthur looked back at the panel, then at his own two hands, and then gestured towards the creature, inviting it to help. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silent standoff continued, the only sounds being the child's soft cries and Arthur's own heavy breathing. Then the creature glided forward. It was impossibly graceful, moving without a sound. It stood beside him at the opening, a being from another world. It reached in with its own three-fingered hands. As its skin brushed against his, Arthur felt a strange tingling warmth, like a mild electric shock, and his mind was suddenly filled with a cascade of images and feelings: the cold of deep space, the blinding light of 1,000 stars, the terror of the crash, and a deep, soul-crushing feeling of being lost. Together they placed their hands on the panel. Arthur set his feet, took a deep breath, and heaved. The creature pulled alongside him. The panel, which had felt bolted to the floor, now lifted with surprising ease. It was as if the creature wasn't just lifting with its physical strength, but with its mind, somehow lessening the object's weight. They moved it just enough. The second adult quickly scrambled forward and gently freed the child's leg. It then gathered the small one into its arms, and the whimpering subsided, replaced by a soft, purring hum. The child's skin glowed faintly, and in its hand it clutched a small, smooth stone that pulsed with a soft, warm light. It was a handful of light. The first being turned its dark, unreadable eyes to Arthur. The pressure in his mind was gone. In its place was a new feeling, one he understood perfectly, for it was as universal as fear. It was gratitude. And then another, more complex thought, a question that echoed not in words, but in pure concept. What now? Where is safe? Arthur looked at the family huddled together in their broken vessel. He looked out at the dark, silent woods that were his home. He thought of the world beyond those woods, a world of sirens, helicopters, scientists, and soldiers, a world that would tear this family apart. He had lived a quiet life, a simple life, but in that moment, standing under the silent watching stars, he knew that his quiet life was over. He had a new secret to keep. "You're safe here," Arthur said firmly, making a promise to beings who couldn't understand his words, but could feel the conviction behind them. "Come on, let's get you out of the cold." Getting them to leave the wrecked ship was the first challenge. It was clearly the only home they had known for a very long time, and the thought of abandoning it, even in its broken state, filled them with a palpable sense of anxiety. Arthur felt it as a low hum in his mind, a static of distress. He didn't use words, he used gestures, the universal language of trust. He pointed to the sky, then made a sweeping motion with his hand to indicate the whole forest, and pointed to himself and his house, a distant yellow light barely visible through the trees. He was trying to convey a simple message. The world is big and dangerous. I am small and safe. The taller one, which seemed to be the leader, regarded him for a long moment. It then turned to the other adult, who was still cradling the small, injured one. They exchanged a look, and though their faces were impassive, Arthur felt a complex, silent conversation pass between them. It was a debate, a risk assessment, a leap of faith. Finally, the leader turned back to Arthur and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The journey from the crash site to the barn was a strange, silent procession. Arthur led the way, his flashlight beam bobbing ahead, illuminating the familiar path that now felt like a trail on an alien world. The three beings followed him behind. They moved with an unearning grace, their feet barely seeming to touch the forest floor. The injured child was carried, its small body still glowing faintly, the light pulsing in time with its soft, purring breaths. Arthur was acutely aware of the absurdity and the danger of his situation. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The hoot of a distant owl sounded like an alarm. What in God's name was he doing? He was a simple man. He fixed fences, tended his garden, and read old paperback novels. He wasn't equipped for this. He was harboring refugees from another world. The very idea was insane. If anyone found out, the government, the military, they would descend on his quiet life like a pack of wolves, and he, along with this strange, silent family, would be devoured. But then he'd glance back. He'd see the larger alien keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings, its head constantly scanning the dark woods. He'd see the other parent gently stroking the small child in its arms. He saw not monsters or invaders, but a family, lost and frightened. And the crushing weight of his fear would be replaced by a stubborn, protective resolve. This was his land, and on his land he offered shelter to those in need. It was as simple and as complicated as that. They reached the clearing and the great cavernous shape of his barn. It was 100 years old, built by his grandfather with timber from these very woods. It smelled of hay, old leather, and time. To Arthur, it was a place of work and memory. To the aliens, he hoped it would be a sanctuary. He slid open the huge, groaning wooden door and gestured for them to enter. He didn't turn on the electric lights. They were too harsh, too revealing. Instead, he lit an old kerosene lantern that hung on a post just inside. The flame caught, casting a warm, flickering golden light across the cavernous space. The air filled with the familiar, comforting smell of burning oil. The aliens glided inside, their dark eyes wide, taking in the strange new environment. They looked at the stacks of hay reaching up to the rafters, the old rusting tractor sitting under a dusty tarp, the leather harnesses and tools hanging on the walls. It was a museum of a forgotten human era, and to them, it must have seemed like the inside of an ancient alien temple. The leader approached a thick wooden support beam and placed its three-fingered hand upon it. Arthur saw a flicker of understanding in its posture. It felt the history in the wood, the strength, the organic life of it. A feeling emanated from it, not of fear anymore, but of quiet wonder. Strong, alive, old. Arthur pointed them towards a large, empty horse stall in the back, filled with clean, dry straw. "It's not much," he said, his voice a low whisper, "but it's dry and warm. You'll be safe in here. No one ever comes in here but me." The second parent carried the child into the stall and gently set it down on the soft bed of straw. The little one uncurled, its injured legs stretched out awkwardly, and looked up at Arthur with its huge, dark eyes. It was no longer crying. The fear had been replaced by a child's simple curiosity. Arthur retreated, giving them space. He hung the lantern on a hook outside the stall, its golden light providing a soft, reassuring glow. He watched as the two adults settled around the child, their slender bodies curling protectively around it. They were a portrait of a family seeking comfort in a strange new world. The light of the lantern caught the faint pearlescent shimmer of their skin, making them look like figures from a dream. He stood there for a long time, a silent guardian at the door of his barn, the old shotgun forgotten, and his world changed forever. He was no longer just Arthur Pembroke, a lonely old farmer. He was a keeper of a secret, as vast as the night sky itself. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, he knew with absolute certainty that he would protect that secret with his life. The first days settled into a strange, silent routine, a ballet of caution and quiet curiosity. Arthur would wake before dawn, his mind no longer on the weather or the price of feed, but on the secret hidden in his barn. He'd do his morning chores as he had for 50 years, a perfect pantomime of normalcy for any prying eyes that didn't exist. Then, with a bucket of fresh, clean water from the well and a basket of vegetables from his garden, he would slip into the barn. He discovered they didn't eat, not in the way he understood it. They would place the vegetables, carrots, leafy greens, ripe tomatoes, into the bucket of water. The taller one, who Arthur had started to think of as the sentinel, would then dip its long fingers into the water. The water would shimmer, clouding for a moment with a faint silvery light, and the vegetables would seem to soften, their vibrant colors fading slightly. Then the family would each take turns drinking the infused water, a slow, deliberate process. It was as if they were drinking the life essence of the food, not its physical form. Communication was the real challenge. It was a slow, painstaking process built on gestures and patience. He learned their roles through observation. The sentinel was the protector, the leader, its posture always alert, its dark eyes constantly scanning. The other adult, who seemed to be the caregiver and moved with a gentler grace, Arthur called the weaver, as its hands were often busy mending the child's strange, fabric-like garments with glowing, thread-like energy drawn from its fingertips. The little one was simply the child, curious and bright, its initial fear replaced by a cautious fascination with Arthur's world. The child's leg was a source of constant worry for Arthur. It was still swollen, and the little one moved with a pained limp. He brought his old first aid kit into the barn one afternoon, opening it to show them the rolls of gauze and bottles of antiseptic. The weaver looked at the items, then looked at Arthur, and gently shook his head. It then projected a feeling into his mind, not of rejection, but of simple incompatibility. Different, not for us. Then the weaver showed him how they healed. It knelt by the child and placed its hands on either side of the injured leg, not touching, but hovering just above the skin. A soft, warm, golden light emanated from its palms, enveloping the child's limb. The child let out a soft, contented hum. The healing was slow, a process that would take time, but it was happening. It was magic, plain and simple, happening in the dusty hay of his forgotten barn. One evening, driven by a profound need to understand who they were and where they came from, Arthur brought an old, leather-bound atlas into the barn. He opened it on a dusty workbench, the lantern light illuminating the faded colors of the maps. He pointed to Pennsylvania. Then he flattened the page showing the map of the United States. He tapped his chest. He said, "Here, my home." The sentinel glided over, its tall form eclipsing the lantern's glow. It looked down at the map, its head tilted. It seemed to understand the concept of a map, of representing a large space on a small surface. Arthur felt a flicker of excitement. He then turned the page to a diagram of the solar system in the book's appendix. It was a simple, colorful drawing showing the sun and its 9 orbiting planets. He pointed to the third planet from the sun. He said, "Earth," tapping the page, then pointing down at the floor. "Here." The sentinel stared at the diagram for a long time. Arthur could feel a profound sadness radiating from it, a melancholy so deep it felt like a physical weight. Then the alien lifted its hand and held it, palm down, just above the page. From its palm, a soft, three-dimensional light began to glow, coalescing into a shimmering, holographic image that floated in the air above the book. It was a star map, but it was a sky Arthur had never seen. In the center were not one, but 2 suns. One a brilliant yellow-white, the other a smaller, cooler orange. Around them spun a complex web of planets, moons, and shimmering asteroid belts. The sentinel's long, graceful finger pointed to a small, blue-green world in the orbit of the twin suns. And then the image shifted, showing the planet from close up. Arthur saw swirling continents of a strange shape, oceans of a deep violet color, and cities that glowed with a soft internal light. The final image projected into Arthur's mind was of their ship, sleek and whole, leaving that blue-green world. He felt their sense of purpose, of exploration, and then the crash. A blinding flash of light, a sudden violent tearing, the chaos of falling, and the overwhelming, crushing silence of being lost. The hologram faded, leaving only the lantern light and the dusty old book. The sentinel stood perfectly still, but Arthur could feel its silent grief. They weren't just visitors. They were castaways, shipwrecked an unimaginable distance from home. Arthur looked from the simple drawing of his own solar system to the memory of the sky with 2 suns. The gulf between their worlds was vast and absolute. For the first time, he truly understood. They weren't just hiding in his barn for a few days. They were here to stay.
For nearly a month, their secret world remained inviolate. The child's leg healed completely, the soft golden light from the weaver's hands knitting bone and sinew back together with no sign of injury. The child, now mobile and energetic, became bolder, often peeking out from the barn door to watch Arthur as he worked, its large, dark eyes following his every move with an intense, unblinking curiosity. The sentinel remained ever watchful, a silent, graceful statue, but Arthur could feel its apprehension lessen with each passing day. A fragile sense of peace settled over the old farm, but they all knew it was a peace that could be shattered in an instant. The threat, when it came, arrived not in a black helicopter, but in a dusty, beat-up pickup truck. Dale Hardy was a local hunter, a man who knew these woods almost as well as Arthur did. He was younger, brasher, and saw the forest not as a home, but as a resource. He often set traps on the periphery of Arthur's land, a fact Arthur tolerated with grumpy resignation. But one Tuesday afternoon, his truck came rattling up Arthur's private road, a cloud of dust billowing behind it. Arthur's heart leaped into his throat. He was outside, mending a fence, and had a clear view of the approaching vehicle. He forced himself to stay calm, to lean on the fence post as if he had all the time in the world. Inside the barn, he knew, the family would have already sensed the intrusion. He could almost feel their sudden, sharp spike of fear. Dale pulled up, shutting off the loud engine and leaving a ringing silence in its wake. He swung out of the cab, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Afternoon, Arthur," he called out, his voice a little too loud for the quiet clearing. "Dale," Arthur nodded, his face a mask of neutral politeness. "What brings you all the way up here? Game's been scarce this season." "Tell me about it," Dale grumbled, kicking at a loose stone. That's kind of why I'm here. Been tracking a big buck for 3 days. Smart one. Kept losing the trail right around your property line. But that's not the weird part. Arthur gripped the fence post, his knuckles white. Oh? What's the weird part? Been finding strange tracks, and last night I was out late up on the ridge, saw a light coming from your barn. A weird, soft, kind of pulsing light. You getting fancy? Installing some kind of solar lamps in that old wreck? Arthur's mind raced. He had been so careful with the lantern, always shielding it, never leaving it on too late. But the alien's own bioluminescence, he hadn't thought of that. He forced a dry chuckle. Hardly. Probably just a reflection. My flashlight beam bouncing off some old piece of tin. As for the tracks, you know as well as I do the woods are full of critters. Dale didn't look convinced. Yeah, maybe. He gestured with his head towards the crash site. And what about that mess over yonder? Looks like a damn tornado came through, tore a straight line right through the trees. Never seen lightning do that. Wind shear, Arthur said immediately, the lie coming easier than he expected. That strange silent storm we had a few weeks ago. Came up fast and hit hard. Took down some of my best oaks. He had spent days dragging branches and debris to make the crash scar look more like natural storm damage, but he knew it wasn't a perfect cover. Dale chewed on his lip, his gaze sweeping across the property, lingering on the barn. The silence stretched, thick with suspicion. Arthur knew he had to take control, to misdirect. He pushed himself off the fence post. Tell you what, Dale. You're right. Game's been skittish. I think it's poachers. Been hearing noises at night myself. Even found a spent cartridge over by the creek last week that wasn't mine. This was a complete fabrication, but it was plausible. Dale's eyes lit up with a hunter's predatory interest. Poachers? On your land? Seems so, Arthur said, starting to walk towards his house. Probably why your buck is spooked. Listen, I'm getting too old to go chasing armed men through the woods at night. But if you see anyone, you call the sheriff. Don't go playing the hero. These are desperate folks. He had turned the object of suspicion from himself to a phantom enemy. Dale's focus shifted. The mystery of the light in the barn was now just a detail in a larger, more familiar story of poaching and trespassing. Damn right, I'll call the sheriff. Appreciate the heads up, Arthur. He got back in his truck, started the engine with a roar, and drove off, leaving Arthur standing alone in the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. He had bought them some time, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wouldn't be the last time someone came looking. The world was starting to press in on their fragile sanctuary. That night, he made a decision. He took the old, heavy padlock from his main gate and fixed it to the barn door. It was a small gesture, but it was a clear statement. This place was no longer just a barn. It was a vault, and he was its sole guardian.
Dale Hardy's visit was a loud, clanging alarm bell in Arthur's quiet world. He realized that ignorance was no longer a shield for the family. It was a liability. It wasn't enough to hide them. He had to teach them. He had to explain the complex, illogical, and often dangerous world that existed just beyond the tree line. His classroom was the barn. His teaching tools were the relics of his own long life. He started with the basics. He brought in an old battery-powered radio and turned the dial. He showed them the cacophony of human existence, the angry shouts of talk show hosts, the saccharine sweetness of pop music, the somber, measured tones of the news. He tried to explain the concept of different languages, different nations, all crammed together on one small, noisy planet. He felt the reaction in his mind, a dizzying wave of confusion and overwhelming sensory input. To them, it must have sounded like pure chaos. He showed them photographs, faded, black and white pictures of his parents, their faces stern and proud, a picture of himself as a young man in a soldier's uniform, his eyes full of a terrifying, misplaced certainty, and a color photograph, its edges soft with time, of his wife, Eleanor, her smile as bright and warm as a summer afternoon. He pointed to the picture of Eleanor, then tapped his own chest, and finally his heart. He projected the feeling as best he could. Love, loss, a profound and enduring ache. The weaver glided closer, its large dark eyes fixed on the photograph. It gently placed its long fingers on the glossy paper, and Arthur felt a soft, empathetic echo of his own grief, a shared understanding of what it meant to lose a part of yourself. In that moment, the gulf between their species seemed to vanish, replaced by a shared, universal sorrow. The most difficult lesson was about the concept of threat. How could he explain guns, soldiers, and the insatiable, often cruel curiosity of his own kind? He showed them an old National Geographic magazine, one with a cover story about wildlife researchers tagging a bear. He pointed to the tranquilizer rifle, the net, the steel cage. He pointed to the scientists in their clean white clothes, their faces professionally detached. Then he pointed from the magazine to the family, trying to convey the simple, brutal message: this is what they will do to you. The sentinel understood immediately. A cold, sharp feeling of dread emanated from it, and it instinctively moved to stand in front of the child. But the most surprising lesson came from an unexpected source. One afternoon, Arthur wheeled in an old, dust-covered television set on a wobbly cart, along with a small generator. He wanted to show them moving pictures, to give them a better sense of his world. After several sputtering attempts, the generator roared to life, and the television screen flickered on. He put in an old VHS tape of a nature documentary, something simple, something about the migrating birds of North America. The family watched, utterly transfixed. The child sat inches from the screen, its eyes wide with wonder at the flocks of geese soaring through a blue sky. But it was the weaver who seemed most captivated. He wasn't just watching the screen, it was sensing the technology. It tilted its head, a gesture Arthur had come to recognize as deep concentration. Suddenly, the image on the screen wavered, the colors bled, and the picture dissolved into a storm of static. Arthur sighed, assuming the old VCR had finally given up. But then a new image began to form in the static, coalescing from the electronic noise. It was a star map, the same holographic map the Sentinel had shown him, with the twin suns and the violet oceans of their homeworld. Arthur stared, dumbfounded. The weaver had its hand extended toward the television, not touching it, but influencing it. It was somehow interfacing with the old analog machine, projecting its thoughts, its memories directly onto the screen. It was a ghost in the machine. The weaver then changed the image. It showed their ship, not crashed, but whole and perfect, gliding through the silent darkness of space. It showed the family inside, peaceful, observing the cosmos. And then it showed the accident. Not a collision, but an encounter with a strange web-like energy field that appeared from nowhere, ensnaring their ship and tearing it from its path. Arthur realized he was witnessing their logbook, their history, played out on the screen of a junk shop television. The weaver wasn't just a caregiver, it was their archivist, their historian. It held their memories, and it had found a way to share them. For the first time, Arthur wasn't just guessing at their past, he was seeing it. He saw not explorers, but scientists, observers, a family on a long, peaceful mission, tragically thrown off course. He now understood that their abilities were far beyond simple telepathy or healing. They could interact with energy, with technology, in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. And this realization brought with it a new, chilling thought. If they could do this with an old television, what could the world's powerful technologies do to them? How could they possibly hide from a world of satellites, listening stations, and machines designed to find things that didn't want to be found? The days following the weaver's unexpected display of power were filled with a new kind of anxiety for Arthur. He spent hours in the barn, trying to understand the implications of what he had witnessed. If they could manipulate energy, could they protect themselves? Or would this very ability make them even more valuable, and thus more hunted? His musings were cut short one sweltering afternoon in late July. He was in his garden pulling weeds when he heard it, the distinct, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a helicopter. Not a civilian chopper, but the heavy, purposeful beat of a military bird. His blood ran cold.
He dropped his gardening tools and stumbled towards the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the sky. It appeared over the tree line, a dark, menacing silhouette against the brilliant blue. It was a black, unmarked helicopter, low and fast, heading directly towards the crash site, not even bothering to circle his property. Arthur didn't even stop to grab his shotgun. He burst into the barn, his chest heaving, his face pale. The family was already alert. The sentinel stood in the center of the stall, its form rigid, its dark eyes fixed on the ceiling, sensing the approaching threat. The child huddled behind the weaver, its small body trembling. "They're here," Arthur gasped, pointing towards the sky. "The military. They found the crash site." He expected panic or questions. Instead, the sentinel raised one of its slender hands. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his mind, like a static shock, followed by a rush of images. A web, a net, invisible but tangible, spreading out from their ship. It was a defensive shield, a cloaking field. The helicopter hovered directly over the crash site, its rotors kicking up a storm of dust and leaves. Arthur peered through a crack in the barn door. He watched as two figures, clad in dark tactical gear, rappelled down from the chopper. They moved with the trained precision of soldiers, immediately fanning out and beginning to search the area. They carried strange devices, dish-shaped antennas and flickering handheld screens, sweeping them over the torn earth and the still embedded craft. Arthur held his breath, expecting shouts, an announcement of discovery, but there was nothing. The soldiers moved around the tear in the forest, then around the exact spot where the ship lay, as if it wasn't there. They swept their devices over it, walked past it, even through the edge of the invisible field, and yet they saw nothing. They were walking over a ghost. Inside the barn, the sentinel stood perfectly still, its hand still raised. Arthur could feel the immense effort it was expending, projecting this unseen net. It was a mental and energetic strain, a silent battle of wills against the sophisticated instruments of the military. He felt flashes of the sentinel's internal struggle, blinding, confusing, dangerous. After what felt like an eternity, the soldiers gave up. One of them gestured impatiently, shaking his head. They exchanged a few curt words, then secured their gear and signaled the helicopter. The chopper descended, picked them up, and then, with a final, contemptuous thump, 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 it flew away back over the tree line as quickly as it had arrived. Arthur collapsed against the barn door, his legs weak with relief. He looked at the sentinel, whose hand slowly lowered. The tension in the barn evaporated, replaced by a profound weariness. The sentinel's pale skin seemed a shade duller, its usual subtle luminescence dimmed. The weaver immediately moved to its side, placing a hand on its shoulder, a gesture of silent support. "They didn't see it," Arthur whispered, a choked laugh escaping his lips. "They didn't see anything." He understood now. The crash site was cloaked, not just visually, but in every measurable spectrum. The technology of their ship, damaged as it was, still possessed abilities far beyond human comprehension. But the effort, it was taxing. They couldn't maintain it indefinitely. And the military wouldn't just give up. They would be back. They would bring more. Arthur knew he had to act. The crash site was a beacon, cloaked or not. The longer it remained there, the greater the risk. He thought of his old rusting tractor, the chains in his tool shed. It was a crazy idea, a desperate idea, but it was the only one he had. He looked at the three beings who had become his strange, silent family. They had shown him wonders. They had shown him how vast and mysterious the universe was. Now he had to show them how resilient and resourceful one old human could be. He had to make that ship disappear.
The decision was made. The ship had to move. Leaving it in the woods, even cloaked, was like leaving a loaded gun on a playground. Sooner or later, someone would stumble upon it. The only truly safe place was the barn, but getting it there seemed an impossible task. The next morning, Arthur began his preparations. He went to the tool shed and gathered the thickest, heaviest chains he owned, links of steel as thick as his wrist, rusted from decades of disuse. He spent 2 hours working on the old tractor, a beast of green and yellow iron that hadn't been run in over a year. He cleaned the plugs, checked the oil, and filled the tank with gasoline. When he finally turned the key, the engine sputtered, coughed a thick cloud of black smoke, and then, with a deafening roar, it roared to life. The sound was a violation of the farm's newfound peace, but it was the sound of hope. He waited until the moon was high and the woods were bathed in a soft, silvery light. He drove the tractor to the crash site, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The family was already there, waiting for him, their pale forms almost ethereal in the moonlight. They had felt his intention, his resolve. Arthur worked methodically, wrapping the heavy chains around the teardrop-shaped craft. It was difficult. There were no edges, no protrusions to hook onto. The smooth surface was slick, almost frictionless. After several failed attempts, the Sentinel glided forward. It pointed to a barely perceptible indentation near the base of the ship, then to another on the opposite side. Arthur realized it was showing him the ship's structural strong points. With the Sentinel's guidance, he was finally able to secure the chains. He climbed back onto the tractor, the cold metal of the seat, a familiar comfort. He took a deep breath, engaged the gear, and slowly, carefully pushed the throttle. The tractor's engine screamed in protest, the massive wheels spinning, digging deep furrows into the soft earth. The chains went taut, groaning under the immense strain, the steel links glowing a dull red from the friction. But the ship didn't move, not an inch. It was as if it were fused with the planet itself. Arthur tried again, pushing the engine to its limit. The tractor roared, a desperate mechanical cry against the silent forest, but the result was the same. He slumped in his seat, defeated. It was too heavy. It was like trying to tow a mountain. He was about to give up when he felt a gentle touch on his shoulder. He looked down and saw the weavers standing beside the tractor, its large dark eyes looking at him with reassurance. It pointed towards the Sentinel. The Sentinel stood before the ship, its back to Arthur. It placed both of its long, slender hands flat against the dark, cool hull. It closed its eyes. A deep hum began to emanate from the craft, a low-frequency vibration that Arthur could feel in his bones. The air around the Sentinel and the ship began to shimmer, distorting the moonlight like a heat haze. Arthur felt a new message in his mind, clear and direct. Now, pull. Now. He didn't hesitate. He slammed the tractor back into gear and pushed the throttle forward. This time, the effect was instantaneous. The groaning of the chains was replaced by a smooth, steady tension. The tractor's wheels found purchase, and the great machine lurched forward. Behind him, with a deep, sucking sound of earth giving way, the alien craft began to move. It slid from its earthen prison, gliding over the ground with an unnatural ease. It wasn't light, but it was manageable. The Sentinel was somehow manipulating its mass, reducing its gravitational tie to the Earth. It was a symphony of old and new, of brute force and subtle power. The roar of the internal combustion engine and the silent, psychic hum of an alien mind working in perfect harmony. The Sentinel walked alongside the moving craft, its hands never leaving the surface, its concentration absolute. The Weaver and the child followed, their eyes wide. Together they towed the fallen star through the forest, its dark, impossible form sliding between the ancient trees and into the cavernous mouth of the old barn. They positioned it in the far back, in a large unused section where Arthur used to store farming equipment that was now long gone. He unhooked the chains, their metallic clatter echoing in the sudden silence as he shut off the tractor's engine. The ship sat in the middle of the floor, a piece of a distant galaxy, resting on the worn oaken floorboards of his grandfather's barn. The immediate danger was over. The scar in the woods would heal, the cloaking field could be dropped, but now the secret was no longer out in the forest. It was here, in the heart of his home, a constant, silent presence. He had moved a mountain, but in doing so, he had locked himself inside its shadow.
2 years passed. 2 quiet, secret years that unfolded like a dream.
The scar in the forest healed over, covered by new growth, its sharp edges softened by moss and seasons of fallen leaves. The world outside seemed to forget the strange storm and the brief, unsettling visit of the black helicopter. Life on the farm fell into a new, extraordinary rhythm. The barn was no longer just a barn. It was a home. The family had explored every corner of it, and the sentinel, ever the protector, had somehow reinforced its old decaying structure with a subtle, invisible energy field that kept the winter winds out and the summer heat at bay. The Weaver, with its ability to interface with energy, had managed to draw power from the ship to create a soft, ambient light that mimicked the twin suns of their home world, casting strange, beautiful shadows on the old wooden walls. The child, who was no longer so small, grew rapidly in the safety of its new home. It had developed a profound bond with Arthur. It would follow him as he did his chores, a silent, graceful shadow mimicking his movements with a touching, childlike earnestness. It would watch, fascinated, as he repaired a tool or tended his plants. Arthur, in turn, found a joy in his old age he never thought possible. He would talk to the child for hours, telling it stories about Eleanor, about the war, about the world he had known. The child couldn't understand the words, but it felt the emotions, the memories, the love in his voice. They were a family, a strange, impossible family, bound not by blood, but by a shared secret and a quiet, unspoken affection. The loneliness that had been Arthur's constant companion for a decade had vanished, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since he was a young man. But Arthur was getting older. The aches in his bones were no longer just a complaint, they were a constant grinding pain. His breathing became shallow, and a persistent cough settled deep in his chest. He grew tired easily, often having to stop and rest for long minutes while walking from the house to the barn. He knew what was happening. His body, a reliable machine for over 70 years, was finally beginning to fail. The family knew it too. They could sense his dimming life force, the weakening of his internal energy. The sentinel would watch him with a new, intense concern. The Weaver would often approach him and place a hand near his chest, not touching, but projecting a gentle, warm, healing energy. It helped, easing the pain for a few hours, but it was like trying to patch a collapsing dam with a handful of clay. They could mend a broken leg, but they couldn't stop the relentless march of time on a human body. The crisis came on a cold night in late autumn. Arthur woke up with a crushing pain in his chest, a fire that stole his breath. He collapsed on the cold linoleum, his vision tunneling into darkness. His last coherent thought was not of himself, but of them. What will happen to them? Who will protect them? And then he felt a presence. The farmhouse door slid open without a sound. 3 slender, silent figures glided into the room, their pale forms glowing faintly in the darkness. The sentinel stood guard at the door, its gaze fixed on the outside world. The child stood back, a silent, frightened witness. The Weaver knelt beside him. It looked down at Arthur, its large dark eyes filled with an emotion he could now recognize as a profound, sorrowful compassion. It then placed its 3-fingered hands on his chest, directly over his failing heart. Arthur expected to feel the familiar, gentle warmth of its healing energy. Instead, he felt an intense, piercing cold, like a plunge into icy water. His mind was flooded with images, not his own, but theirs. He saw the inside of their ship, the complex, living technology that powered it. He saw shimmering conduits of light, energy flowing like water, systems being repaired and rerouted by thought alone. He felt the weaver's mind, a consciousness of immense complexity and power, as it assessed his body not as a mystic but as a master biologist, a brilliant engineer. It was analyzing the failing machine of his heart, understanding its blockages, its weaknesses, its flawed design. Then the weaver did something extraordinary. It reached not just with its energy, but with its mind deep into his body. It was not a physical act, but it felt more real than any surgery. He felt a gentle, precise manipulation from within, a clearing of pathways, a strengthening of worn-out muscle, a calming of the chaotic, dying rhythm of his heart. The pain began to recede, replaced by a steady, strong, unfamiliar beat. He felt the child approach him and place its own small, warm hand on his forehead. It projected a single, powerful feeling into his mind, a feeling of pure, undiluted love and a desperate plea. Stay. Don't leave. The last thing Arthur saw before he lost consciousness was the weaver's face, its skin glowing with a brilliant golden light, its dark eyes filled with the strain of an impossible effort. It was not just healing him, it was rebuilding him.
Arthur awoke, not to the familiar murky light of dawn, but to a world of impossible clarity. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the silence of the woods, but the silence within his own body. The constant low-grade static of pain he had lived with for years was gone. The wheezing in his lungs, the erratic flutter in his chest, the grinding in his joints, all of it had vanished. He took a breath, a deep, clean pull of air that filled his lungs to their very depths, something he hadn't been able to do in a decade. He sat up, not with the usual series of pained grunts and careful maneuvers, but with a single fluid motion. He looked at his hands. The wrinkled, liver-spotted skin was the same, but the tremor was gone. He felt new. More than new. He felt remade. Inside his chest, his heart beat with a slow, steady, powerful rhythm, a rhythm so calm and strong it felt alien to him. He could feel a faint, quiet hum deep within his tissues, a resonance that was not his own. He found the family in the main room, waiting. The child, its eyes wide, rushed to him and gently touched his hand, its touch a question. The sentinel stood back, its posture one of weary relief. The weaver was huddled in a chair, its usual faint luminescence almost completely gone. It looked diminished, exhausted, as if it had given away a vital part of itself. And Arthur knew, with a certainty that went beyond thought, that it had. In saving him, the weaver had woven a part of their own life force, their own alien biology into his. The energy that had rebuilt his heart was drawn not just from the weaver's own body, but from the dormant systems of their ship in the barn. He could feel it now, a faint, unbreakable connection to the silent, dark craft. He was a part of their system, and they were a part of his. They had not just saved their protector, they had anchored themselves to him, their last best hope in a foreign world. Life changed after that. Arthur's aging process didn't stop, but it slowed to a crawl. The man who had been fading away was now filled with a quiet, enduring vitality. He could work all day without tiring. His mind was sharp, his senses acute. He felt the changing of the seasons, not just in the air, but as a subtle shift in the energy of the earth beneath his feet. The secret he kept was no longer a burden of fear, but a purpose for living. He was no longer just a guardian. He was an ambassador, a bridge. He spent his days not just protecting the family, but learning from them.
Through the Weaver's projections on the old television screen, he traveled to worlds of twin suns and violet oceans. He learned of a civilization that had outgrown war, a species that communicated through pure empathy, a people for whom technology and biology were one and the same. In return, he taught them what it meant to be human. He brought them books, playing them classical music on an old record player. He showed them the beauty and the sorrow, the art and the violence, the boundless compassion and the heartbreaking foolishness of his own kind. Years turned into a decade. The decade turned into two. The world outside changed in loud, dramatic ways, new technologies, new conflicts, new fears. But on the old Pembroke farm, time moved differently. Dale Hardy moved old and moved to Florida. The town of Mill Creek dwindled, its young people leaving for cities, its memory of the strange storm fading into forgotten folklore. Arthur Pembroke became a local legend himself, the old hermit in the woods who never seemed to get any older, the man who bought supplies once every few months and vanished back into his forest, a quiet, timeless figure. The child was now as tall as the sentinel, its movements filled with confident grace, its mind a repository of two worlds, the one that it had lost and the one that it had found in the dusty corners of an old barn and the stories of an old man. One clear, cold autumn night, decades after the crash, Arthur sat on his porch, just as he had on that first fateful evening. The now adult child sat beside him, not on the swing, but on the porch steps, its pale form a pale silhouette in the moonlight. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They looked up at the vast, star-dusted canvas of the night sky. Arthur's gaze fell upon a familiar constellation and then drifted beyond to the deep, dark spaces where other suns burned. He was an old man, far older than his body suggested, and his life had been a quiet one. But he had seen wonders. He had harbored a fallen star, and in return, it had given him a new universe. He was not lonely. He was the keeper of a sacred trust, the guardian of a silent embassy. He was the man who had heard a sound in the silence, and instead of running away, had chosen to listen. And that choice had made all the difference.